Again, we are going to have our lecture on the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is spelled for you on the board. It's an annoying word. Going to take 15 more seconds to get the title of your lecture written down. This is a pretty short lecture, so we should be able to get through it pretty fast. It is 7 slides. And then we have another short one tomorrow. Okay, are we good? Okay, so the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is often considered the 4th branch of the United States government. So again, the bureaucracy, their nickname, voices should be off, and we should be writing this down. Yes. The bureaucracy often gets the nickname of the 4th branch of the federal government. So we have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The bureaucracy often gets the nickname as the 4th branch. The bureaucracy currently employs over 3 million people. So it's huge. And examples of bureaucratic groups can range from the president's cabinet, so like the Secretary of State, all the way down to the IRS. And we're going to go ahead and jump straight into what this bureaucracy looks like. The president is in charge of the bureaucracy. So like the bureaucracy falls under the legislative branch, the executive branch. Yeah, the president or the executive branch is in charge of the bureaucracy. So like, as you guys can see in this visual, he's in charge of who's in his office, who's in his cabinet, independent agencies like the CIA, regulatory commissions like the FCC, and then just literally things as simple as the US Post Office. So these are just examples, like this is the giant umbrella that it covers over. If you work for the bureaucracy, it's usually based on your merits. So like what kind of qualifications you have. So yes, most of these jobs, like if you work for Amtrak, the post office, the CIA, it's based on your merits, it's based on your qualifications. Or if you're on the higher ups of the bureaucracy, like the cabinet, you might be appointed and then approved by the Senate. So again, the president's cabinet departments, so Secretary of State, Education, Transportation, all that stuff, that falls under the bureaucracy, and they're nominated and then approved by the Senate. Any questions about the structure of what the bureaucracy looks like? Mike, can you pull your head down for me, please? That's Congress. So like Congress is involved in like cabinet departments. So like they approve these secretaries. They might authorize funds to the CIA and things like that. But the president is the overarching like head of all of it. So there's some shared power between the president and Congress over bureaucracy, but overall, it falls under the executive branch. Somewhat, yeah. It falls into that where they're like they either work together for certain things. Yes, Alexis. Congress. Sorry, guys. Okay. So this is just, so this still goes under that slide. It's just a different cartoon. So some people see the bureaucracy as just like a block in the system. So the bureaucracy, a lot of people consider it to just like limit the effectiveness of the government. So a lot of people see the bureaucracy as being ineffective because they require such a vast amount of paperwork. Yeah, like it's ineffective because of the amount of paperwork, the certain steps that you guys have to take. I know that we watched one episode together as a group. How many of you guys have seen Futurama? Okay, you know Hermes Conrad, that character? That's like the running joke is that he works for the central bureaucracy and you see how like pedantic he is and all of the different things that he has to do. So like Hermes Conrad is a good example of the character of like how a lot of people see the bureaucracy in general. Now, there's also a concern for the bureaucracy because of accountability. So as Kayla pointed out earlier, this shared idea of Congress and presidents towards the bureaucracy is like a sample of checks and balances. Most people's concerns about the bureaucracy is that there are unclear checks and balances surrounding them. So now we're going to look at the history of the bureaucracy. Just to name for if you guys are setting up your notes, patronage and spoil system are connected. So in the early history of this country, bureaucracy was not merit-based. It was not based off of your qualifications. Instead, it was a form of patronage, or also known as the spoils system. So it was not merit-based in the beginning. It was based on a system of patronage, also known as the spoil system, and I'll explain what that is in a second. So what patronage means is people would be rewarded with a job that they may not have been qualified for. So if you are a loyal Democrat and the Democrats are in charge, you might get rewarded with a job that you have no real reason to have. But as we can imagine, that's not going to work well, right? If you just give people jobs that they're not qualified for. And in fact, because of this, you guys probably haven't heard a lot about him, but President James Garfield. Oh, okay. He was not an orange cat. So President James Garfield was assassinated by someone who wanted a patronage job, and he didn't give it to him. It's the same thing as patronage. It's just like another term for it. So again, James Garfield, one of our presidents, was assassinated just because he didn't give somebody a job under this idea of patronage, which basically raised the red flag for the issue of having these jobs be about patronage and not merit-based. Which leads us to the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. Now, the Pendleton Civil Service Act was passed to prevent patronage. So again, the Civil Service Act is passed in 1883 to prevent patronage, and it also creates the merit system. Which could include things like written exams. So if you were applying for a job, you would have to show that you knew what you were talking about. Now, what does the bureaucracy do? That's the real question. So, the first and probably the most important thing that the bureaucracy does is it writes and enforces regulations. Again, it writes and enforces regulation, I'm sorry, writes and enforces regulations. When a law is passed, it is often very vague. And so it's up to the job of the bureaucracy to take a law that has just been passed and figure out a way that it can actually be enforced. Laws are usually vague after they're passed by Congress. So after the law is passed, that's when the bureaucracy comes in and actually figures out what is this law going to look like in practice? And what kind of rules do we need to have to make it possible? Does that make sense? Okay. The bureaucracy is also in charge of enforcement and fines. So they're also in charge of enforcement and fines. So they make sure that companies or legal firms are following regulations. So an example of this, you don't have to write this down unless it's helpful. An example of this is the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA will go to different large companies and make sure that they are following certain guidelines that are not polluting the earth, that are regulating how much carbon monoxide goes into the air, that type of thing. Does that make sense? A bit. I mean, they have rules. Okay. And finally, the last major thing that the bureaucracy is important for is they testify before Congress. People who work for these different bureaucratic systems are often experts in their field. So for example, somebody hopefully who's working under the Secretary of Education would be an expert on education. And so if Congress is working on a law to either expand educational resources or whatever that might be, they might call on those experts from the Secretary of Education's department to come in and share their opinions on the law. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. How are we already falling asleep? This is the shortest lecture ever. Eddie, wake up. Okay. The bureaucracy is often considered to be 1/3 of a part of the iron triangle. The iron triangle refers to the relationship between Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy. It's the relationship between Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy. And it is a very tight relationship between these three entities, and they usually join together to pass policies. And it's, I mean, I know it's in the shape of a triangle, but it's basically like a circle. So you have an interest group will create electoral support for certain members of Congress. Then Congress will find funding and political support for different members of the bureaucracy. And then the bureaucracy will give special favors or low regulations to interest groups. So it's a lot of within this triangle of people, that is how things get done, which also include things like special favors. Two more slides. Okay, so the federal executive branch officers can shape the enforcement of policy through three different things. I'll say that one more time. Federal executive branch officers, the bureaucracy, can shape the enforcement of policy through three ways. Did we all catch that first part? Those three ways are instructions, directives, or personal interpretation of the laws. Those are the three ways. I'm sorry. So again, the three ways are instructions, directives, or personal interpretation of laws. These groups also have discretionary authority, which they get from Congress. So these, the bureaucracy gets I just said that word wrong, discretionary authority from Congress. So they get discretionary authority from Congress, which means that Congress has given these departments varying degrees. So again, Congress has given these departments varying degrees of discretion in developing rules and interpreting legislation. Legislation. And this discretionary authority is where most people's issues with the bureaucracy come from. People, when we look at discretionary authority, ask the question, does it violate separation of powers? So again, it's with discretionary authorities where we have those questions. Does it violate separation of powers? And is it democratic to have these people who were not elected to make all these decisions? So again, discretionary authority is when people get the most iffy. But they may have all this power, but it is still limited somewhat. And this is the last slide. And they are limited through a few different ways. One way is called the power of the purse. Bureaucratic agencies cannot spend public funds until a committee authorizes it. So again, under power of the purse, bureaucratic agencies cannot spend public funds unless they get approval from a congressional committee. Any questions on power of the purse? Okay. Next, we're just going to look at the Whistleblower Protection Act. So because like checks and balances does go both ways, if you are working for a bureaucratic agency and you see something sketchy going on, you might be tempted to stay quiet, right? Because your job could be on the line if you say anything. And so in 1989, Congress passes the Whistleblower Protection Act. And the Whistleblower Protection Act prohibits a federal agency from retaliating or threatening an employee for disclosing important information. Sorry, I know that's getting chunky. Yes. So the Whistleblower Protection Act prohibits a federal agency from retaliating or threatening an employee for disclosing acts believed to be illegal. I just froze it, so it should stay up there. You guys were using the subtitles. I did just freeze it, so it should be still there. Whistleblower Protection Act prohibits a federal agency from retaliating or threatening an employee for disclosing acts believed to be illegal. And finally, you have the US Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has the power to regulate or protect the bureaucracy. The Supreme Court has the power to either limit or expand bureaucratic power. Now, what is important to note about the Supreme Court is they do tend to give the bureaucracy more power. Okay, that is the last content slide. I do have a slide projected onto the screen. I just want you guys to take 3 minutes to review these 2 questions and just make sure you can answer these questions based on your notes. And if we need to fill in any gaps, we will do that. And then that's it for the lecture. So number 1, define discretionary authority as it pertains to the bureaucracy. An agency's ability to decide whether or not to take certain courses of action when implementing existing laws. So just like make sure you can define discretionary authority and make sure you would be able to justify why somebody might call it the 4th branch. Everybody feel good about those 2 questions? For those of us that are awake. Okay. Any questions on the bureaucracy? Cool. Okay, so if you guys can go and flip to page 3 of your classwork. Okay. So